I spent about 10 years making these things that look like generative art. I didn't even know what to call them at the time. At this point, I'd given up trying to show my work in galleries. You just didn't know how to take it. Is this graphic design? Is this mathematics? What is this? So I'd just given up on that whole route. There's never not been a time when I haven't made art. My first memories were making scribbles, when I was 2 even. So all I'd think about is drawing, playing with Lego and building things in my mind. And I think when I was maybe about 15, I'd already decided I wanted to be an artist. Eventually did go to art school. I quit before I even finished my first year. At that point, I started getting interested in mathematics and geometry to make art. There were so many different styles, so much had been explored in paint already. So I thought, well, because I was already interested in math and geometry, I always have been, it just seemed like if I pursue this, I have a higher possibility of making an original mark, an original composition if I go down this route. And that was of the most importance to me, to try and make something original. I think it's always been really important to try and do something that's not been done before. I started to read things like Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, and I became really immersed in that, and I was so in my head. I was pretty much just living in isolation. I didn't have anybody to talk to, so it just amplified that. I went to a bookshop and there was a sacred geometry book, and I picked up this book called The 3 Pillars of Zen. It was like a manual on how to meditate. I read that book from cover to cover in like 2 days, shaking, thinking I have to do this. I meditated 3 hours that day, and that slowly grew to like 5 hours after about half a year or so. I decided I was going to go to a monastery. I sold a few things I owned. I got off the plane basically with $20 in my pocket, and I just hitchhiked to Rochester over a couple of weeks. I'd spent 2 weeks living like that without any money, just sleeping under bridges and kind of eating out trash cans and stuff, and I decided I'd continue to live like that, meditating in the morning and the evening, and then just living on the streets. And then after 6 months, I did meet Lauren, my wife, and we got married and we had kids. So I went from that life to, within a few months, effectively having 2 kids. And at that time, we didn't even have a computer in the house. I think it was around 2000 where my wife bought a computer, and I started to make websites. I started to publish patterns. They were kind of derivatives of my artwork, patterns for people to put in their backgrounds on MySpace and things like that. And they were really popular, and people said, well, can you make me this pattern in a certain color? And I think, well, maybe I could just build a tool to edit these things. Through that project, I built this site that's called Pattern Cooler, where people could edit patterns in colors and change the scale and stuff. About 12 years ago, I started to get into this class of geometric objects called quasi-crystals. So I started to build these visualization tools, and then I slowly transitioned to making art from these tools. So I spent about 10 years making these things that look like generative art. I didn't even know what to call them at the time. I'd heard about NFTs, but then I listened to a podcast with Snowfro talking about what they'd done with art blocks, and straight away I thought, this is a home for what I've been working on for a long time. I belong in this space for sure. It's actually Photon's dream. Then soon after that, I released Fontana, which was received really well, and then I got lots of opportunities from that project. Having experienced that sort of type of life of being very low, and then sort of like, having success and having something like this, right, where the attention's all on me, it just feels very surreal that anybody would be interested in what I'm doing. With this project, Quasi-Dragon Studies, this is the first long-form generative project I've undertaken, which ties right back to that period where I was working with, I call it geometric meter. The first thing that grew out of that new approach was this motif that forms the basis of Quasi-Dragon. If you imagine at one point you've got a circle of 0 radius, and then you've got a line here which is effectively a circle of infinite radius, and then you've got all the circles in between. And that basic building block forms the dragon bodies. And that just seemed to naturally tie into my interest in Eastern philosophy, because the dragon in Eastern cultures is this mythical creature that spans both worlds. And that seemed to kind of also be part of this fundamental geometry, this 0 to infinity, the relative and the absolute. Because of this geometric constraint, the outputs lend themselves naturally to being joined. We have these elements called tiles, and they have joining traits on the edges where the geometric elements overlap. And these joining traits enable 2 tiles to be joined together. I struck on the idea, okay, we could have a project where tiles can be placed together by a collector, and they can take part in that co-creation. They can spend time finding tiles that work well together, sort of explore their own creativity,